Murder at the Gibson County Fair. The Gertrude Downey story. The Gibson County Fair in 1888 was held in the month of September. Our fair got its start in November of 1853, when the first fair was held on the courthouse grounds, with several agricultural items being on display, along with livestock tied to the fence. The Gibson County Fair in those first years, as it is today, was one of the most successful fairs in the entire Midwest. The fair grew quickly and soon had to be moved to a larger area to accommodate the crowds. The current fairgrounds were acquired and have been home to the fair since the early 1860s, and even became known as Camp Gibson during the Civil War. The fairgrounds housed soldiers and provided the Union Army a place to muster and train troops, as well as have close forces standing ready to protect Indiana soil. During those first several years, the fair was a joyous occasion for many Gibson County families, but in 1888, the mood would turn to sadness with the murder of a young lady at the fair, attended by 5,000 people. Sylvester Grubb, once a resident of Princeton, but having moved to Oakland City, pulled a gun from his belt and shot Gertrude Downey of Francisco 3 times. 2 rounds caught the teenage Gertrude in the arm, and 1 entered her skull near the eye. Gertrude would run for her life, but didn't make it far before collapsing from her wounds. Witnesses would surround the gunman, and comments were already circulating in the crowd of plans to seek justice on this madman for what he had just done. Grubb pointed the pistol to his own head, and when the gun failed to discharge, he reloaded and held the crowd at bay, waving his pistol in the air until lawmen arrived. When police confronted the shooter, he quickly gave up and was taken into custody. Both the victim and the soon-to-be killer were rushed from the fairgrounds. Downey taken to the home of a local doctor, with efforts underway to save her life. The other rushed away to keep the angry mob from lynching him from a fairground tree. Later that night, police had to get Sylvester Grubb completely out of Gibson County for fear of an attack on the jailhouse by the angry mob seeking immediate justice. Gertie was treated for a while in Princeton, and at some point over the next few days was moved to a home closer to her parents' Francisco home. The young lady would fight for a few days, but in the early morning hours of September the 19th, 1888, about 4 or 5 a.m., and after the recurrence of severe bleeding, she died from her wound. With the passing of Gertrude, Sylvester Grubb was now being accused of murder in the Gibson County courts. When the judge told the sheriff to prepare for a hanging, and told Sylvester of the punishment if convicted of the crimes he was charged, the killer would burst out in court declaring he was a carpenter and would save the sheriff and people some money and build the gallows himself. Several times in the months to follow, Grubb would announce to the media or to the courts that he wanted to build the hanging gallows he would soon be put to death on. Awarded a change of venue, the trial of Grubb would move to nearby Vincennes and would be heard in the Knox County courts. Gertrude's father would sell pictures of his daughter outside the courthouse and in the streets in order to have the money needed to stay in Vincennes for the trial. During the trial, the defense would argue that Grubb was insane, and family members of Grubb's attempted to back it up with stories of strange actions and a story of a heat stroke suffered by Grubb, which they claim after which he was never the same. Grubb had called on Gertie at her parents' Francisco home several times in the months before the murder. However, with his sometimes strange actions, the Downey family, all, including Gertie, would slowly start to discourage him from continued visits. Sylvester made a few threats and even wrote a letter to Gertie threatening her life if she did not change her mind and allow his visits. His hope was if he could just make visits, she would at some point in the future fall back in love with him. This would never happen, however, and Gertie would tell Sylvester the same that day at the county fair. A great deal of excitement surrounded the trial as it proceeded in Vincennes, stemming from several different events taking place during the weeks the killer was held for his crimes. One bit of excitement was the day the killer escaped from the jail. After sawing through the bars and escaping through the roof, he went quickly to a local store and acquired a .38 caliber pistol. Sylvester had told other inmates if he ever got out, he would be the single cause of the sale price of coffins going up. He went on to say that he would likely go on a killing spree and kill any police officer who would get close to him. A few days into his escape, he was located by a town marshal in southern Illinois. He was taken back into custody without incident. The marshal told Grubb he was looking for a chicken thief and needed to ask him a few questions, and if he himself had seen anything of chicken thieves. Sylvester fell for it, thinking the lawman would never connect him with the murder and escape from the Knox County Jail. Other events of excitement were attempts by mobs to kill Grubb before he was convicted of his crimes. So many wanted this animal dead that Grubb was moved to an Indiana jail near Louisville, Kentucky, and was transported back when needed for court appearances by train car. One night a train was stopped along a track between Princeton and Francisco by horsemen on the tracks impeding the train's movement. The plan failed when the mob did not find Grubb aboard the train. A second attempt by an even larger mob was made on the airline train as it passed through Gertie's hometown of Francisco. A mob of 60 armed men would ambush the train after a few men had flagged the train, acting as if they wanted to board for the ride to Princeton. When the train pulled up and the conductor stepped out and announced all aboard the steam engine, and the track was flooded with men set on lynching Grubb for his crimes. Again, the mob was disappointed. Lawmen had fooled them by first taking the killer to Evansville and then to the north. After Grubb's conviction, the sheriff of Knox County was tasked with performing the hanging ordered by the courts to be done on the jail lawn. The sheriff called in a man who traveled the country assisting with hangings. This man knew this was to be the last hanging in Indiana held by local authorities, and that soon the state of Indiana would carry out all executions. He wanted the job which was soon to be appointed by the governor as executioner. The day of the execution, a few hundred invited guests would be allowed to view, guests mostly being family of the victim or of the killer, and a throng of media would also be allowed to watch. The hired hangman declared the execution a success. After the trap door sprang from below Sylvester Grubb's feet, and he fell with the noose tightening around his neck. It would take about 8 minutes of time following the abrupt fall for the body to go completely limp, and for doctors to rule there was no longer a pulse. After a few minutes, the doctors reported the body still twitching, and sounds coming from under the black hood tied around the head and the now stretched neck. Successful, yes, the killer was indeed dead, but not exactly in the manner most would think of when thinking of a successful hanging. Back in Francisco, in the hilltop cemetery where Gertrude Downey's body was buried, lies the remains of a lady cut down far too early in her young life. Over the last 100 or so years, linger stories from folks seeing a female walk the grounds late at night.